right, I think we've got everyone here with us now. Welcome, everyone, to this discussion. More militarism is not the answer. My name is Rachel Small. I'm the Canada organizer with World Beyond War. We're a global grassroots network working to end the violence of militarism, to abolish the institution of war. And we're organizing in solidarity all the time with those who are most impacted by its violence. Tonight's event is co-hosted by Peace Brigades International, which is a global movement of activists seeking justice and peace, and they support and stand in solidarity with threatened human rights defenders across the world. Their human rights accompaniment work is really incredible. This webinar or this discussion is also co-sponsored by the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. Um, we have had an unfortunate, very last minute change to our speaker lineup. Unfortunately, Harsha Walia has had to drop out at the very last minute, but I'm really thrilled to announce that Syed Hussan will be stepping in as a speaker tonight at the last minute. So big thank you to you. I'll go ahead and introduce all of our speakers now. Syed Hussan is the executive director of the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. Beside him, we've got Tyler Shipley, who's a professor of history and economics at Humber Polytechnic and the author of two books, including Canada and the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination. Next to that, we've got Clayton Thomas-Müller, member of the Treaty 6-based Matthias Clome Cree Nation, also known as Puckatawagan, land defender and activist. Clayton's also an award-winning film director, media producer, and best-selling author. I am so thrilled tonight to be moderating this conversation, really hoping to join it alongside these really thoughtful organizers, thinkers, people that I admire quite a lot. Normally, this is the part where I would kind of introduce the topic, give a whole bunch of political context. But the goal here tonight is really to have a real conversation and to dig in deep. So I'm thinking let's switch things up. And yeah, let's actually just get right into it without taking any more time. So I'd love to just jump right into the news cycle. I mean, the past few months, it's been very, very much centered on Trump, on him continuing to threaten Canada, constant unveiling of new tariffs, and then the Canadian government and frankly all the major political parties in response pushing for Canada to ramp up its military budget, which I will remind us is precisely what Trump is demanding that Canada do. So maybe let's start with Tyler. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about this response to Trump's threats, like this idea that the way Canada is going to protect itself from the US is by radically increasing our military spending.
I mean, you already sort of said it. Like, there's an absurdity to the very notion that Canada somehow defends itself from Trump by doing precisely the thing he's asking. But I want to thinking about all of this the last couple of days, and sort of what are we thinking of in terms of Canada at this moment. I feel like I want to foreground, certainly for me, and I'm interested in what everyone thinks about this, but. You know, my project is not to defend Canada or protect Canada or save Canada. And I feel like I need to get this off my chest before we even start because I don't want to be misunderstood. Like, I'm not giving strategic advice to Mark Carney or anyone else about how do we protect Canada from Trump. That's just not my project. And that's not to say that I support Trump or that I think annexation is good or anything like that. It's just, for me, it's important to clarify the project. And the project for me is decolonization of this land, right? Both the territory claimed by Canada and that of the US. So it's like I want to kind of put that on the table before even addressing the Trump question. And then with that said, it's like, okay, so what should we think of Canada's response to Trump's sort of demand for increased NATO spending? Well, Canada has for a very long time been in what Paul Kellogg describes as a kind of a parasitic relationship with US militarism. The Canadian ruling elite benefit from the umbrella of US imperial protection. And of course, Canada participates in it and has participated more than ever in the last 20 years. But there is a certain bizarre truth in Trump's claim that that Canada doesn't necessarily pull its weight with respect to imperialism. And in a sense, Trump is demanding that if Canadian capital wants to keep enjoying all of the benefits of rapacious exploitation of people around the world, then then they have to foot part of the bill, which I think is, I mean, there's a certain irony in that. So in a sense, I think that's kind of the broader context. And now, just to finish on the point that you already made, to the extent that Trump is demanding that Canada spend more on its military, Canada making the choice to then turn around and spend more on its military, claiming that this is defensive, claiming that this is like how we protect ourselves from the U.S., from some kind of U.S. invasion, is a little ludicrous. Like there's no context in which the Canadian military is going to repel a U.S. invasion. That's just inconceivable. It's just not even. It's inconceivable in the sense that these two militaries have been deeply integrated. They've been deeply intertwined in a very conscious way. And this dates back as early as the 1950s when Canada pushes the Defense Production Sharing Agreement, which was basically an economic military deal on who would produce what, which country is going to produce which things, how is this all going to be integrated so that the two countries aren't producing the same things, to sort of, again, allow Canada to be a sort of military parasite, an imperial parasite on the US. And in the last 20 years, there's been, since 9/11, an explicit push to radically integrate the two militaries to such an extent that the Canadian former head of Canadian Forces, Walter Natinchik, was actually leading commanding a force of like 35,000 American troops in the war in Iraq, the invasion and colonization of Iraq. So these are deeply intertwined militaries, and the idea that Canada boosting its spending will help it repel an invasion from the U.S. It frankly it boggles the mind. So that's, I guess, my just sort of initial thoughts on it, but I'll be really interested to hear what everyone else has to say about it too.
And on that very last point, maybe I'll just say like, so I mean, World Beyond War for many years with many allies has been campaigning for Canada to not buy the F-35 fighter jet, to not buy 88 new bomber jets. And recently, this campaign has taken off in large part because we've clearly shown like this is an American weapon system through and through. The source code of the F-35 is literally processed through American computing facilities. We can't maintain, we can't upgrade, we can't do anything to these aircraft without direct approval, supply chains, etc., from the US. So the US would have a kill switch on these jets. And so in this very specific political moment, all of a sudden we have Carney weirdly agreeing with us. Maybe we actually shouldn't buy these F-35s from the US and promising to kind of reassess this major weapons purchase. Of course, our opposition is not only that it's US based, but like that these are fighter jets that are designed to do exactly what we've seen them do in Gaza over the past year and a half, right? Like to kill civilians, turn cities into ruins, like drop bombs on populations. But I'm saying this because the F-35 is not the exception to the rule. I think the F-35 is exactly the norm in terms of the way the Canadian weapon systems that we're buying like are actually 100% dependent on US military cooperation to even be able to fly them.
hmm Just wanted to sort of jump in here. I really agree with you, Tyler. I think we are having this conversation that's so bizarre as if Canada and the US are in a tariff war, right? I think that's the first act. We're in a tariff war. Now, elbows up, Canada must defend itself. And step three is then therefore buy Canadian, build our own weapons, etc., etc. So I think we need to question every one of these steps because it's not that there's a tariff war happening. What's happening is Canadian ruling class has to pay slightly more for the privilege of selling to the American consumer, right? And then, you know, at this point, what we're seeing is so they've already announced US Canada very deep trade and security integration conference that's going to take place as soon as the election happens. So they've already agreed to that. but you don't hear about it as much. You keep seeing these photos and images of everyone wrapping themselves in the Canadian flag. I think that's not what we're seeing. We're not in a war with the US. We are, as you said, like a very close ally and a coordinator of, if we go back, like, in part, we can speak to about this later, but the US's entire project right now is all about encircling China. These tariffs are about encircling and reducing the power of China. And in part, one of the most significant acts in there was the US-led invasion of Korea, which resulted in the breaking down of those two countries. And Canada sent 28,000 troops there. Like, this is a single military project. And there's no, I think Canada wants to give its water and its critical minerals, which it sees as is, and I agree with you, it's not Canada's, right, to the US. And I think all the parties would fall over themselves to continue, whether it's Trump or Biden or Obama, whether it's Polyev or Trudeau or Carney, to do the integration.
Yeah, I totally agree that it's absolutely ridiculous that, conservative voices in this country are entertaining like that militarization would somehow stave off a US invasion should that, would that happen, or China or Russia for that matter. Um, and I think that a lot of this framing, the word parasite was used, from an indigenous perspective. I've always framed Canada as a resource colony of military superpowers, namely the United States, our biggest trading partner. And this has dramatic impacts, that are much more disproportionate to Indigenous peoples. And and from a number of levels, the texture to how this impact is disproportionate, to everything from, who staffs military, it's poor people, it's Indigenous peoples. That was a very common thing growing up, not coming from wealth, was, my cousins, my colleagues, my Native friends going into military because they're having a baby and they had to provide. And they couldn't afford college. And so, I think that when we look at this expansion, this ask for militarization by the right, it's just part of the same old delay and dupe tactics to con the public into fast tracking irresponsible extraction projects. Now, whether that's for the booming rare earth minerals market, every single missile they're firing at Gaza and the genocide has about 900 pounds of rare earth minerals in it. So they are absolutely required for the application of military technologies, and that there is a renaissance across this country in the mining sector. Even here in Manitoba, with the most popular premier in the country, Wab Kinew, and his NDP government, they are deeply in bed with the mining sector and are deeply, invested in expanding and militarizing the port of Churchill in the Hudson Bay here in Manitoba, because of the fact that this is set to become the biggest export terminal in the hemisphere because of the free Arctic Ocean, the free sea ice due to climate change. The Arctic Ocean routes coming out of Hudson Bay, out of Manitoba, cut ocean shipping lanes by 8,000 kilometers to anywhere on planet Earth. So, geopolitically, this is a massive issue for Indigenous peoples and those Manitobans living in that region because of the investment that's coming in, the thousands of workers that are coming in, the automation of the port, the dredging of the beluga whale sanctuary. So these oil tankers, they're very heavy. Tar sands oil is 10 times more heavy than conventional oil. To get these ships in, they're going to have to do some pretty destructive things in one of the most beautiful, international tourist attractions of these lands they call Canada. The polar bears and the beluga whales. And all of this, of course, is running roughshod through Indigenous peoples' territory, namely my nation's territory, Pugatawagan Cree Nation. We own the train line to Churchill, Manitoba. Manitoba, Canada, Prime Minister Carney want to build a freeway to Churchill. A NAFTA free trade freeway, I've heard it called over the years. Um, and that intention hasn't changed. And so indigenous peoples need to understand that, this is being framed as economic development, as opportunities, but we're the ones who are going to have our water poisoned by expanding gold mines and other rare earth minerals mines. We're the one who are going to see our forest chopped down to make way for highways and for these mines and all this other development that's going to come with the Port of Churchill expansion. And we're the ones who are going to have to live with the military bases that Carney wants to install all over the Arctic Canada. And, that's Inuit people who got to live with that stuff. And just ask the Beaver Lake Cree about what it's like to live beside a bombing range to know that it's hell on earth.
Absolutely. And none
Yeah,
of this is what's in the news, obviously. Sorry, go ahead, Tyler. Yeah.
no, no. I was just gonna just kind of pull from what Clayton's saying. Like, I think we are being told right now that we should be part of some kind of nationalist moment. Defend Canada, protect Canada against this American threat. And I'm at great pains to emphasize that for most people, and everything Clayton just said about what Indigenous people in northern Manitoba are going to deal with, that's going to happen regardless of which faction of the ruling class is in charge. I mean, it doesn't matter if we all rally behind the Canadian ruling class and then it's them that does it, or if Trump somehow finds a way to annex Canada and then it's American capital doing it. Frankly, I don't care. I'm opposed to all of that shit happening in the first place, and I don't care which section of the ruling class does it. And I think that's been my biggest frustration about this moment, has been the way that all of the work we try to do to fight against these things has been derailed and kind of railroaded into let's all be nationalists, let's protect Canada from Trump. That's not my project. I listen to everything Clay is saying, and it's like that's happening anyways, and that's what I'm opposed to. I don't care about Trump, frankly. The problems that we have with our own ruling class. So yeah.
I mean, speaking of things, I guess, that are not our project, I want to take a second to, like, I guess, debunk some of the other kind of dominant narrative in the media. I mean, so maybe I should have said this right at the top. So Canadian military spending has already been ramping up tremendously. Like, it's doubled from about 20 billion to about 41 billion just in the past decade. And now we're talking apparently about doubling it again to at least 82 billion. That would be to reach this kind of 2% NATO spending target. And this 2% number has kind of been everywhere. It's getting thrown around a lot. Maybe back over to you, Tyler, if you can spend a second to kind of unpack for us what that actually is and where that comes from. It's being shared as like this common sense, this is the way Canada does good in the world kind of number. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I just, I think it goes back to a NATO agreement from, I want to say 2006, that was then maybe formalized in 2014, but it was an agreement among all of the NATO states that they would each contribute, or they would aim to contribute 2% of their GDP on military spending, which would then obviously, theoretically strengthen the NATO alliance, which I hope all know by now is essentially just a kind of a way in which one block of capital centered around the U.S. and the West organizes itself, organizes and plots out its kind of grand geopolitical strategy, which actually, in some ways comes back to what Hussan was saying already about China. And I think, I don't even know if this is something we're interested in talking about tonight, but certainly it's fair to say, we have already for the last 20 years been entering a new phase in global capitalism, a new era of inter-imperial rivalry, with a block of capital rising in China that will, I think, inevitably at some stage, overtake the United States as the center of world capitalism. Obviously, Trump's project is to try to offset or prevent that from happening, which is why the focus on Greenland, on Canada, on Canada's north, and all of these things, the Arctic sort of sovereignty questions that are coming up now. So, NATO is traditionally, since the Cold War, been the body through which the West carries out its sort of larger imperial designs, whether that's in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, wherever. So yeah, the 2% thing, I mean, for me, the important thing about it is just what you said, Rachel, which is the ramping up of military spending, which, yes, predates this, long predates this. It's been ramped up since the late 90s, when there was this kind of so-called crisis in the Canadian military, the lost decade. Where is all our military spending? And since that time, pretty much every budget has pushed the Canadian military higher and higher and higher, under obviously liberal and conservative governments.
I'm rarely in the habit of quoting politicians and probably much less conservative ones, but I just today stumbled on a quote from former Senator and conservative MP Douglas Roche, which said, "The 2% NATO target is one of the greatest frauds ever perpetrated on a gullible public by the military-industrial complex, which drives American policy, which in turn drives NATO." And I thought that was maybe the most concise way I've seen that summed up. And that was by a sitting conservative MP arguing against that several years ago. But maybe moving a little bit from the headlines, I mean, as has already been brought up, like this military budget increase we're talking about that's already happening, that's promising to escalate much more. I mean, it's not only a capitulation to Trump's demands. It's not only, like you said, Tyler, like kind of a laughable response to his threats that we would use this military budget increase to somehow fight back against the US. But it's not laughable because it's a deeply harmful plan. Like this is something that has devastating material consequences for people here, for people around the world. Um, and for you, Hassan, I want to turn this question to you. Like the border militarization has been a really big part of the push from the US in the past few months and very explicit. And in its last few days in office, the Trudeau government highlighted that it was going to spend 1.3 billion on enhanced border security. That specifically was going to include deploying heavily armed RCMP officers and these big Black Hawk helicopters to the border. And it was explicitly framed as like a response to Trump's tariff threats. So I'm curious if what you want to share and what you can share about what this means on the ground. Like, how does this actually impact people's lives?
Mhm. I think the first thing I want to say is, migration policy is now possibly the most crucial um, determinant and organizer and kind of canary in terms of a lot of global politics, right? So Trump's election is in so much part of, he was able to get elected on a platform of xenophobia. It is only because right now, around the world, people are struggling. You can't pay rent, you can't pay for your groceries, and they're looking for someone to blame. And in this moment, that someone to blame can either be the ruling class or it can be the foreigner, the other, the migrant. And whether it's Australia, whether it's Italy, whether it's, UK, whether it's New Zealand, whether it's Canada, whether it's the United States, there is a global configuration of anti-migrant policies. Here in Canada, for example, the last 2 years, the almost everyone has been told that there were too many migrants and immigrants coming, which affected the housing stock, right? So just to give you an example, as of October of 2024, that was before Trump's election, Canada had changed policies such that every day 3,000 study and work permits are expiring daily for the whole of 2025 and the whole of 2026. That's 3,000 people being forced to leave the country every day. 2.3 million people total are going to be either self-deported or deported by the end of 2026. If this was the context of the US, which is 10 times bigger, that would be equivalent of kicking out 23 million people, right? When we say 2.3 million people, we only have 40 million people in this country. I think it would be like, I don't know, Winnipeg, really like just actually just throwing Winnipeg out of the country. I don't know exactly. I'm just looking at Clayton, like, give me the population. But
Yay!
no, my point is that's what a center-left Trudeau government was able to do with absolutely no real counter response. I think the Canadian left progressives have sort of just allowed this to happen. So it's no wonder then that Trump is able to get elected by becoming anti-immigrant. And then, of course, border securitization becomes really central to it because it's not so much about strengthening the border, it's about beating the drum on xenophobia. that US-Canada border sees very minimal movement of people. Okay. Now, by minimal, I mean it's about 20,000 or so people going back and forth, right? That's not a small amount, but if you look at the global flows of human beings, that's not that significant. So $1.3 billion have been put, and it's already been spent. And it's mostly spent, as you said, on RCMP and helicopters, with primarily on drones. 400 million of that has gone into border security, which will be in country, so-called detentions and deportations. As a result, the Canadian Immigration Enforcement has announced it's currently deporting around 16,000 people. It will be able to ramp up to 20,000 people a year. That's about 55 or so a day by the end of the first quarter. So actually, that US border militarization is being used to increase detentions and deportation in the country. So we are seeing what? More raids, more people being targeted. What does that mean? It means that everyone else is going deeper underground. That means the more exploitative bosses are going to continue to hire people, but just exploit them more. People are going to get access to fewer rights. So imagine 3,000 study and work permits being denied every day in this country, and this mass removal of people happening. And put this into the global context, what it is climate catastrophe is going to produce migrants and refugees. We don't want them here. Global, like they're not buying these weapons to not use them. Rachel, you and I were talking about it earlier, right? They're going to use them, which means people are going to be murdered, annihilated, but also become migrants and refugees. They won't be allowed here because we are all building fences. So the global militarization and local xenophobia and the anti-migrant hysteria is one story. And I think that that story has to be understood as one. And I just want to say that people can see almost F-35s and oppose them, but I think it's kind of incredible that we have not seen, you know, people take to the street for 2+ million people about to be deported here.
And I, as a former Montrealer, I can say that's more like the population of Montreal. Like that's, yeah, that's the scale of that is nuts. Um, I think that, I mean, it's sort of sticking a bit on the same theme. Like I think that when I encounter in my work at World Beyond War, like discussions about Canadian militarism, people are really often thinking about things happening on the other side of the world. They don't know what the Canadian military is doing on the other side of the world often, but that's what they're picturing when a lot of it actually looks like, yeah, domestic operations of various types within so-called Canada, from like surveillance, from propaganda to policing to militarized colonization. Um, yeah, and Clayton, you've talked about this a bunch tonight already in terms of there has always been this really strong Indigenous resistance to that. Whether we're talking about the pushback to NATO's flight testing over Innu lands in Labrador, to the Dene warriors in the 2000s who were blockading the Cold Lake military base, trying to kick the military off of their lands. Of course, like famously, the moment when the Canadian military was deployed in the siege of Kanesatake, the Oka crisis, or just in the past few years, right? When we saw over and over again the RCMP's militarized Kurg unit raiding Wet'suwet'en territory many times. Yeah, I'd love, Clayton, if you could share with us a little bit more about these ways that the Canadian militarism does play out as an ongoing force of colonization.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, big shout out to all the friend lines out there, that are just surviving and trying to protect what's sacred. Um, Indigenous peoples, we're not a monolith. I don't speak for everybody at all. We've got some super hardcore capitalist bastards in our communities, many in leadership positions doing the same shit Trump's doing. And I just want to, put that qualifying statement out. Um, I think that one thing I've learned as a Native person growing up in these lands they call Canada is that anytime they make federal policy related to militarization or policing, it always impacts my community way more than other communities. I saw that in the 90s with the anti-gang legislation that was meant to take out white supremacist biker gangs. The only people they used it on were my uncles and the Manitoba Warriors here in Winnipeg. They spent $5 million to build a courthouse for seven old Native uncles, which they never even used. Um, and so, like, I guess the point that I'm saying is that, if they buy these weapons, as Hassan said, they're going to use them. And, when they militarize police forces across this country, they use them. And typically in places where the cameras aren't rolling. When we look at where Canadians, okay, card-carrying, law-abiding, tax-paying Canadians, where do they live? Well, they all live within 50 miles of the US-Canada border. And the rest of Canada, which is the second biggest country by landmass on Mother Earth, next to Russia, um, is inhabited predominantly by Inuit in circumpolar regions, by Métis hamlets or Métis settlements, here in Manitoba and some in other parts of the country, but concentrated here in the Red River Valley. And then you have 637 First Nations across the country. And where Canada tends to place the most destructive and toxic extractive industries are adjacent to our communities. And so when we think about environmental racism in this country, it is very much disproportionately a white and red issue. Because Native people tend to pay the price, whether it's from the impacts of climate change that is driven by both conventional and unconventional oil and gas extraction and pipeline building, or whether it's having their water and poison destroyed by, big mining companies that are operating in their territories, destroying their food security. The number of issues that Indigenous peoples face in the whole ecosystem of militarization is immense. And it's the shared experience that Native people have, not just in Canada, but in other economies. I campaigned for years in Alaska, and the biggest polluter in Alaska is the US Air Force. And they work hand in hand with BP and Shell and Exxon and ConocoPhillips to just completely oppress Alaska Native peoples and to extract resources for the American military complex. And I just returned from Toronto from the PDAC conference where I saw Rachel actually. We got to co-MC this amazing protest against the world's largest mining summit. And we were raising the issue about the fact that there are hundreds of pounds of rare earth minerals in every freaking missile that they're shooting at grassroots people, brown people all across the planet, committing genocide left and right. And, I was there to support some Sami indigenous relatives that came in from Norway, Finland, where their fight, the Sami nation is this very small indigenous nation spread out across Norway, Finland, and Sweden and Russia. And they live and they herd reindeer and they fish for salmon. And they live a very peaceful existence, very, very much connected with the place where Creator put them. But they live beside like a dozen nuclear submarines. NATO is right there, and they're pointed against Russia, who's right there. And that coastal region off of Sami territory is one of the most militarized regions in the world. And there are Sami families that have not seen their relatives in Russia for, the last century. They haven't been able to talk. And when we go to the Gwich'in Nation here in northern Canada on the border of Yukon and Alaska, we have families, Dene families from the Athabasca Dene that have been visiting each other downriver for millennia. But now for an Alaska Gwich'in native from Arctic Village, Alaska, to go visit someone in Old Crow in the Yukon, one of the 12 Gwich'in villages on both sides of the border, where the porcupine caribou herd, which they subsist off, migrates along. The villages are based along the migration route of the last remaining mega herd in North America, the porcupine caribou. Um, they got to fly down to Fairbanks, then to Anchorage, then to Seattle, then to Edmonton, then to Old Crow, when they could just take a couple hours skidoo ride across the US Canada border otherwise. So, this the issue already for indigenous peoples with these fake illegal ass borders crossing our territories is really problematic. It impacts our hunting, it impacts our ability to connect with kin in adjacent communities. And when we put our bodies in defense of our land and our water and our climate against these mega mining and oil companies who come in to try and, extract things for the national interest. Well, when we try to say no and when we do our God-given right to be land defenders, our Section 35 constitutionally protected right to hunt, fish, and trap, when we defend that right, Canada brings in their RCMP unit that's totally freaking militarized. And they come in with machine guns and they come in with helicopters and they drop those soldiers into our communities, into our hunting camps and our fishing camps, like they did in Wet'suwet'en. And they cut our cabin doors down with chainsaws, with women and children inside, unarmed. This is what Canada does right now, never mind with the threat of Russia and the United States and Trump and all of that. Is very, very violent for Native people in this country. Just when we try to peacefully protect our land and say no, right? And so we're very concerned about this ridiculous 2% cap. It doesn't make any sense in the era of truth and reconciliation. Native people are concerned about the implementation of the 92 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Native people are concerned with healing our communities and trying to level the economic playing field between Indigenous peoples and the rest of Canada. And this economic development and this participation in this like parasitic military circumstance that's been described on today's call or on today's talk, that just impacts us in such a crazy way because we still don't have drinking water in over 50 of our First Nations. We still don't have roads to many of our communities. We don't have access to healthcare like other communities do. So our people die from things that really you should just be able to go to the emergency room for. But because they got to fly from the Arctic down, they die. I just had a heart attack at Christmas. I would have been dead if I was up in Pugatawagan, doing some work with my people when that happened. But luckily, I was at a ski hill and there was a doctor there who had aspirin. So, and it took 20 minutes to get to the hospital. So I survived. But the rest of Northern Canada doesn't have that kind of privilege. But one thing that we do have as Indigenous peoples, and I'll end on this note, um, is that we have the ability to shut Canada down. If you think back before the pandemic with the Wet'suwet'en, when they faced those militarized police, they put a call out to shut Canada down. And the youth movements of today and all of the other social movements responded. And every single highway and train was shut down in this country. Cities were worried about whether or not they're going to be able to chlorinate their water. And they got a little bit of a taste of what Native people live with every single freaking day, you know, and a little fear. And so I think that we've got a lot of work to do to reconcile Canada's like very violent colonial past. And I think that I'm really glad specifically Hassan's on this talk today. Native people and new migrants like immigrants, our people are the ones who are having babies. We're having babies like no tomorrow, man. And we're the fastest rising labor demographic in this economy, Native people and migrants. And so it's important for our social movements to talk together, and to strategize together, to expand our political base of resistance together, and to eliminate, any kind of mistruths or whatnot in our communities so that we can come together because if the workers of Canada unite with the title holders and that'll give us what we need to build an economy, a people's economy. No war, no warming. Let's build the people's economy.
Well, we should almost end on that note. No, just kidding. But I found that really powerful and really inspiring. I want to jump back a little bit though to what you were saying about like, yeah, the resources that are not making it up north, like how their people are living in like a forced poverty situation, like the minerals are being extracted, but people don't have access to hospitals, etc. And I'm just really struck in that context by what Canada now is promising to bring up north is these new military bases, right? And this is in a context where did we just lose Clayton?
It looks like we did, but we'll see if he gets back on.
Oh, I guess he didn't like my question. Well, I was going to just raise that. I mean, I'm really struck by how in the 90s, NATO allies were conducting all of their fighter jet training over in new territory in Labrador, in part because the jets are just so friggin' loud that they couldn't fly them over Europe. They had to instead terrorize the North. But there was persistent resistance of Indigenous people, and like the Labrador Innu fully blockaded the runways. Many were arrested and imprisoned. And then now we're seeing this repeated in terms of Canada's new fleet of F-35s is again supposed to train and fly over Indigenous territory in the North. We're being told that what's going to secure us are these new Arctic bases. Um, it's like, I think, a repeat of a pattern that Clayton's talking about and that we've seen kind of over and over again. But also, I appreciate his reminder like, Indigenous people can shut Canada down. Like, if they expect that we're going to kowtow to this idea of nationalism and just welcome these Arctic bases, I think that's a joke. Um, I'm curious of some other thoughts that that others here might have about like the other ways that we're seeing this militarization play out domestically, whether that's in terms of policing or whether that's in terms of state surveillance. I'm curious what you two might think about that.
Hassan, I'll defer to you on this one. I've got some. I really liked what Clayton was saying, and I want to connect some of what he was describing to Canadian foreign policy abroad as well. But I think
Just jump on that, and then we can come back. Yeah, roll with that.
okay. Well, I think what I wanted to just add was, the work that I sort of do around Canada. I take Canadian colonial policy as its foundational foreign policy, right? Canada is a colonizer, and its first foreign relations were with Indigenous nations. And so if you want to understand what Canada is and what it projects globally, the best place to start is in Canada's relations with Indigenous nations. You know, the genocide, the broken treaties, the treaties that were signed under false premises in the first place and then consistently broken. The militarized policing, the theft of resources, violence, and so on. So many things. And what I sort of find when I look at Canadian foreign policy, we want to talk about, how do Canadians distinguish themselves in this moment, all of this patriotism? What is it that Canadians think they are that is different from the US? There's all these layers of self-congratulation in Canada about the good that Canada does in the world, the peacekeeping, the humanitarian aid, and so on. And the reality is, Canadian foreign policy has always reflected the exact same dynamics as colonial policy. Canada treats global South countries and people in global South countries in ways that reflect exactly the same dynamics as colonialism. It's about extraction. It's about finding ways of sucking profits out of those places, and all with a profound white supremacy, like just a profound sense of racial superiority that Canada takes into its relations, whether it's in Guatemala or Honduras, in places in Africa and Asia. It's always the same. And certainly, I know we're going to want to talk about Palestine, but the pattern repeats itself there as well. So I think if we're trying to make sense of this moment of national, patriotic elbows up, we're protecting Canada from the U.S. And we're confronted with people who have this belief that Canada is somehow better than the U.S. I mean, I think everything Clayton has just said, and then multiply that by all of Canada's relations elsewhere, and you get a sense of an institution. I'm going to call Canada an institution, just a political framework that just does enormous harm in the world and always has. And so, if we're trying to think through what do we fight for in this moment? What are we trying to achieve? It's not to protect or defend Canada. That just isn't. I don't think that should even be on the agenda. I think it's to fight for a decolonized Canada and work from there.
Please, there was a question for you, but you dropped off. Rachel, do you want to repeat that, and then I can jump in on the policing question stuff.
Yeah, I was just kind of following up on what you were saying, Clay, thinking about all the fighter jet training that NATO was doing over Innu territory in the 90s, and then how a bunch of Labrador Innu were like blockading the runways, were arrested, were imprisoned. Um, and then now we're seeing kind of the similar pattern again, where these new F-35 bomber jets Canada's buying are again supposed to train and fly over Indigenous territory in the north. And again, now Canada is promising not to bring hospitals or clean water to quote unquote the north, but instead to open up these Arctic military bases. I was just kind of commenting, like it feels like cycles of what you were saying kind of happening over again, but also that it's not like Indigenous people are not going to resist this, right? It's not like they're not going to shut down Canada over this kind of thing.
I mean, let's not forget that there was a freaking oil spill that knocked out Nunavut's, like Iqaluit's, like the capital city's water for months. Like it, Canada is an irresponsible nation state that has done reckless things to put Northerners and Indigenous peoples in harm's way, economically and environmentally, otherwise. Um, I think that it's really important right now that, people are aware that Canada has effectively co-opted a lot of Indigenous peoples, especially in leadership positions. When we think about, the national chief or grand chiefs of regional organizations, most of these institutions are not funded by the economic endeavors of nations, of First Nations. They're funded by the federal government. And anytime these institutions speak out against Palestine or they speak out against, Canada's ongoing genocide against our people and destruction and desecration of our land and water and our hunting and fishing and trapping, our ability to hunt, fish, and trap, um, Canada, just continues to cut off funding to these advocacy groups. And so now more than ever, we need social movement vehicles like Idle No More, like Defenders of the Land, like Indigenous Climate Action, to really step up. And we need, the funding community to really fund Indigenous organizations that are organizing people in the North because it's very expensive to organize in northern communities. I once paid like $20,000 for catering for 3 days for a community meeting of 20 people because you got to hire local caterers. They shop locally. The Northern is a genocidal company that charges astronomical prices and they have a monopoly on northern communities. This stuff is very complex. And whenever we're talking about massive budgetary allocations, especially to the fist of the federal government that Indigenous peoples are all too familiar with, we're very, very concerned. And nationalism and this elbows up shit and seeing our premier Wab Canoe, with a 60-foot Canadian flag on the legislator and wearing a hockey jersey with a big Canadian flag on it, it's very disturbing to some of us. Because, nationalism has always been a pathway to, let's just be honest, to fucking Nazis. You look at nationalism movements in Europe and every European economy, and it's dominated by freaking fascists, by Nazis. Poland, the Ukraine, they're constantly having to edit out, Nazi badges and buttons and, all kinds of memorabilia out of the footage that the state of Ukraine uses to promote, its soldiers during this war with Russia. There's a lot of erasure of the real source of Canada's push to delay and dupe the public to try and get extractivism fast track to get an energy corridor across the tr country for east-west transmission built. This is stuff that's been on the table for decades. They've been talking about this shit. Native people have been trying to say, look, you can't just come through our territory and bulldoze We have a right to say no. We have treaties. We have inherent rights. We have constitutionally protected rights. There are international instruments like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada is a signatory of. There's the ILO Labor Convention 169, which also, forces unions to recognize the sovereignty and self-determination of Indigenous peoples. And so, I think Native people, just in the case as the tar sands, and in the pipeline wars that came out of trying to stop the expansion of the Alberta tar sands, a big reason why Native people participated in that and why Dene and Cree and Métis people in Alberta participated in that is because they were concerned about the resources that were being extracted, that they were being shipped to the Strategic Naval Petroleum Reserve in Washington state. That's what the Kinder Morgan pipeline was. It was a pipeline that shipped 300,000 barrels a day to a naval refinery that powered warships on their way to the Persian Gulf. Okay. And it's the same freaking thing when you go all the way back to the nuclear bombs in Japan. That uranium came from mines that were operating in Indian communities, native communities. And the link between extractivism and the impacts and the destruction that comes with this type of development in native communities on native lands and its connection to militarization and the war machine are undeniable. And we have an opportunity to say no to that kind of economic paradigm. We have been in a conversation in Canada about the complete teardown of our economic system and the opportunity to build something completely new that doesn't sacrifice zones or communities or segments of the population, racialized segments, for the benefit of fucking shareholders. Okay? We have an opportunity to come together and to defend our forests, to defend our rivers, to, take care of each other. And Native people have a lot of ecological knowledge on how to do that in a sustainable way that we are still willing to share. But we are not going to stand idly by and let Canada use this nationalist, like blunder to trick everybody. We're not going to listen to the yes men that exist in our native leadership either. And we're going to organize our communities and educate ourselves about the realities that climate change equals never-ending war. And if we just knock out the fossil fuel economy and embrace technologies that are readily available and do the hard work, okay, and that means removing political leaders who are not making the right choices, we have an opportunity to really get, economics right, because I think that reconciliation provides a pathway forward for us, this truth and reconciliation conversation to really name colonization as one of the great evils of the world and to get away from that. And we can do that.
I was just thinking, Clayton, as you were talking about Nazis and nationalism, that Canada has still not released the names of the Nazis that it took in post-World War II, like the actual real Nazis, because they were placed in important positions of power. They were probably settled into the countries. They were scientists who helped build and advance some of these industries that are continuing. And so this project is so intrinsically tied, you know.
Did you want to come back at all to that
Hmm.
question around, yeah, police militarization and other ways that we're seeing kind of the domestic? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think so when we think about militarization, right? Like for me, one of the things we're talking about is like armaments and weapons, right? But militarization is also a kind of like securitization, which is and it's a form of it's the logic of control writ large. When we talk about the war at home versus the war abroad, you know, the war at home begins first by by identifying newer groups or new groups of people again, which must be imprisoned, which must be curtailed, which must see armed gangs, aka the police, go into those communities. And so over the last few years, I mean, you all remember there were these massive protests against queer and trans people in this country, right? And there were defensive positions that were done against them. We've also seen over the last, just in the recent past, we have seen, for example, these massive attacks at drug users, right? So the shutting down of safe injection sites. Obviously, we have, mentioned in terms of the attacks on migrants. So also massive increase in anti-Palestinian racism. So you can start seeing how we as a society are moving towards this, you know, defining new categories of people that can then face all kinds of hyper-securitization, militarization. So what does that look like? Well, what happens to encampments, right? You see these raids. Now, whether those are encampments for Palestine or they're encampments of unhoused people. What do you see? What happens to poor people, working class people who are drug users who can't use safe injection sites? Again, so on one side, we're seeing this increase in police violence. I mean, in Montreal, two people have just been killed in the last week, right, by the police. Here in Toronto, we see this constant murders of people. But the murder is actually kind of the sharp end of the spear. We're talking about the incredible surveillance that is happening in racialized communities, basically like stop and frisk, because, has in the US, which is, called ID check in this in Toronto, has not gone away. We talk about, you know, people are still feeling that it's if it's not the if it's not the police, then it's security guards. If it's not security guards, it's the people denying you access to these services. The bail reform that has been happening in provinces across the country, so-called bail reform, because we have to remember we've seen, like let's count out the right-wing premiers in this country. Like see how many provinces we're talking about, right? Like Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, right? Like Saskatchewan. You've got Nova Scotia now. You've got a huge section of the country controlled by right-wing premiers pushing down expansion of policing. I'm here in Toronto where a so-called progressive mayor has consistently increased the police budget, and that remains completely unchallenged. So where does the police and like police across this country train with the Israeli Defense Forces? They train with the American military. So there's no real disconnect between the military and the policing. And I think really to Tyler's point too, um, that is what Canada is doing abroad. It is a racial logic. To Clayton's point, that is what's happening in Indigenous communities. The one thing I would add is to remember, you know, what is the big game here, right? Like I think people are asking ourselves, like, how do we make sense of this moment? And I think part of this making sense of this moment is to understand that if Canada is part of the imperial project, right, then what is our role as people inside of the empire, right? So, what kind of transformation is required? Because the moment where we do resist, then we will face the sharpest end of the spear pointed at us, because the empire will not allow a rebellion, right? And so, what kind of power can be built? What kind of um, risks do we need to take with ourselves? What kind of courage is required? And I think part of seeing that courage is how we are acting right now when we see our Indigenous sisters and brothers and siblings attacked, when we see our Palestinian sisters, brothers, and siblings attacked, when I see migrant siblings attacked, when we see, like, I think the way in which um, the whole nation is now wrapped up in this nationalist project is deeply concerning. And I think we really need to talk about the weaknesses of our social movements to have preempted this moment, to have mobilized in this moment. Um, there is literally no alternative, right? Like, can you imagine a anti-war demo right now? And like, maybe not about, say, Palestine, but just sort of like writ large against militarization. Um, So I think we really have to ask ourselves, like, what our weaknesses are, because this project, I mean, no matter who wins, as Tyler said, right, whether it's American or Canadian ruling class, we are moving towards global escalation. All of the countries, it's not just Canada, all of the countries in the world are buying more weapons. This is a global rearmament at a scale with a historic scale. This is war footing. It is a question of time. And so we will be asked to pick a side, right? Whether that war is between the US-led bloc against China or Russia. Those are the options. Or Iran, right? So which side will we be on? Because I think we have to understand that um, when we look at, for example, like today's newspaper headline in the National Post is about China interrupting and interfering in the elections, right? There's a lot of drum beating happening to build consensus against China. We have to reject that wholly and truly because it is about primarily ensuring American hegemony, of which Canada is a part. So I think a lot of work has to happen right now and quickly in this moment.
Yeah, and I would just add to, there is a deep, within the psyche of Canadian settlers, there is a deep delusional sense of innocence, like a cult of Canada as somehow innocent of the imperial crimes. I mean, I know people in Canada, settlers who are comfortable talking about U.S. imperialism and all the bad things the United States does in the world, but absolutely draw a line when it comes to Canada and are convinced of this kind of innocence. And there's just a huge amount of work that needs to be done by Canadian settlers to educate themselves about the harm of Canadian imperialism, and it's everywhere, and it's not new. It's pervasive, and it has been. I teach classes, and obviously students from all over the place. Their ancestors are from all over the world, and I will say to them, think about where your grandparents, or great grandparents are from. That country, whatever that country is, Canada probably opposed its freedom, and not just abstractly, but 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 materially. Canada supports the British to try to stop Kenyan independence. Canada supports the French to try to block Vietnamese independence. Like every single case, Hassan, you mentioned Korea. Canada sent, you said it, 28,000 troops to make sure that Korean people couldn't build a people's republic, a sincere effort to rebuild their own country on their own terms. Canada supports and participates, and not at a small level, not just some sort of minor contribution, but makes a major contribution. Canadian soldiers commit crimes against humanity against Korean people, against people in North Korea, but even against people in South Korea whom they were ostensibly there to support. Canada goes around the world to participate in so-called peacekeeping missions, goes to Somalia ostensibly to help keep the peace and protect people in the context of a civil war that was itself an outcome of colonialism. And what do Canadian soldiers do? They kill a bunch of kids and torture and murder a teenager, a whole regiment. Which ironically, when that story breaks in 1993, initially there's some shock within the Canadian media. Very quickly, the case gets sort of boiled down to, it was only two soldiers, both Indigenous. The participation of the entire regiment gets kind of forgotten, gets kind of whitewashed, as if it was just these two soldiers who did it, when in fact, hundreds of members of that Canadian Airborne Regiment participated in, or at least knew about and consented to, these acts of violence against people in Somalia. This is pervasive in Canadian relations with the world, in Canadian settler relations with the rest of the world. So I just think there's a huge amount of work that we have to do to break Canadian settlers of this delusion, and bring people on board with a genuine project of decolonization, not just some exercise of doing a land acknowledgement at the beginning of a meeting, but a real breaking of the systems of Canadian colonialism on this land and everywhere.
Yeah, I think it's really important too that like like the whole freaking oh shit, I forgot what I was gonna say. No, but I do think it's really important too that this myth, this kind of like post-colonial frame of mind that white folks or settlers have in Canada, whether you're first, fifth generation doesn't really matter, but like this maple leaf moose kind of Gatineau Park kind of image of Canada. is very far from reality. Native people know what I'm describing because we live it every day. The militarization and the policing brings criminalization. We got this like fear. I'm just inherently afraid of police. I see police, I can't help but my heart rate to speed up. I look at my kids, I make sure that they're okay. Like, and I'm always telling my sons, like, don't ever talk back to cops. Just be quiet. Just tell them you want to talk to your dad. Tell them you want to call your dad. That's it. Don't say nothing else, because I don't want them to get killed. Because that's a daily reality, not just for Native families, but for brown and black families in this country. And, Canadian imperialism, there's been a lot of great thinkers, including Harsha, who's supposed to be on the call tonight. Who talk about, that Canadian one big facet of Canadian imperialism is this bullying pressure and this arrogance around Canadian mining technologies and around like nuclear technologies, for example. We've been trying to sell these shitty CANDU react nuclear reactors around the planet for decades now, that were paid for with taxpayers' dollars. But people don't want them because they're shit technology. And same with the mining stuff. Canada's constantly being lifted up as this like global standard of excellence for mining, but we're using the same fucking technologies they used a century ago. We're still using big leach heap, cyanide leach heap mines, destroying and, turning freaking lakes into wet tailings ponds, like actual fisheries. Like this is what's happening in Puck, where I come from. Alamos Gold. They just, Bob Canoe was there at the opening singing an honor song. They're building a freaking the massive open pit gold mine there where they're going to fill two lakes with tailings. And these are active fisheries that our people have been using for 1,000 years to fish out of, to feed ourselves. Um, and they're exporting that as though that's the best thing on earth to places around the world where the governments, where militarization is a lot more violent and direct and straightforward. These mining companies are straight up assassinating environmentalists. I've had a lot of friends get smoked by these companies and the paramilitary forces that they hire in these other economies in the global south to just straight up burn communities down that are standing in their way. And these are Canadian mining companies like Hud Bay, like Alamos Gold, that are doing evil, evil, evil things around the planet. And Canada gets to like consistently show up at the UN and say, "Oh, we're a champion of Indigenous rights. We do all this stuff. We did the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They're in our Constitution. We have treaties with the natives, but it's all bullshit." Okay, Native people in this country have less than 1% of our land. The rest is held in trust by this apartheid racist colonial state. And they have all of their economic force is fundamentally tied to the ongoing suppression of Indigenous peoples' collective rights and the displacement of Indigenous peoples from our sacred lands that we've been placed on by Creator. And the urbanization of our peoples and the municipalization of our communities and the taxation, inevitable taxation of our peoples is the goal of this government, assimilation. And so, I think that there's a lot on the table right now, a lot at stake. The war machine is very much tied to climate change, and the biggest climate gangster on the freaking planet is the military industrial complex with the US military at the very top. They are driving climate change. And if we get all those oil tankers, if we get off the fossil fuel economy, more than half of the oil tankers floating around the world right now are transporting crude oil, and coal. And if we get that shit, like the coal and fossil fuel we're burning just to keep these militaries operating, is killing us and it's killing the biosphere. And so we got to do something because there's a scientific consensus by the 99.9% of the world's scientists that climate change is man-made. And they gave us 10 years to deal with it. And there's only 3 years left before it's past the point of no return, where it's thousands of years we're living with violently unpredictable, climate weather-related events, and of course the collapse of agricultural sectors, of water security, and the biggest migration of human beings that there has ever been in our history, which has already started.
Mhm, mhm.
I'd love to come back to a couple of the things that have been raised here. I mean, there's almost too many threads to follow, but I'm like really appreciative, Clayton, of what you're bringing up. And I don't think we can overstate the role of Canadian extractivism in informing Canada's foreign policy, like in terms of direct military intervention and otherwise. And I mean, it feels important to highlight I mean, this conversation we're having right now is obviously in a context of, I mean, Israel once again raining bombs on Gaza, of escalated attacks on Yemen, but also of like very intense and intensifying violence in the DRC, where of course there's a huge presence of Canadian mining companies, where Canada is kind of once again doing this thing of putting out these statements of like, oh, we're so heartbroken about the violence. It's like almost a direct quote, but refusing to condemn any responsible parties. I mean, they do that in terms of refusing to condemn Israel, and they're also doing that in the DRC in terms of refusing to condemn Rwanda, who Canada also has a very close relationship with. Yeah, I think that context doesn't get talked about enough and is really important. And I also want to come back to what Hassan was talking about in terms of like, yes, it is important to remember when we're talking about militarism. And for this webinar, we did specifically use the word militarism, not just military, because it extends well beyond what Canada's military is doing and is about a generalized idea that the government is trying to make very common sense that the way to deal with XYZ issue is with state violence, right? Is with state force. Like that's what militarism is about. But then I also, on the topic of policing, because I have been digging more into this, I do feel like it's also important to highlight that like the Canadian military is also actively directly intervening in policing, is increasingly donating its equipment to Canadian police forces, is training them. Like the idea that there is supposed to be this separation between these two agents of state violence is increasingly not the case. And then looking at its domestic ops, I mean, the Canadian Forces has the largest public relations machine in the country. So at last count, it's over 600 full-time PR staff. Like it's almost a mind-boggling number. So these are people whose full-time job it is to sell the rest of us on war, to sell the rest of us on the need to increase the military budget. That idea that what will keep us safe are these warships, are these border militarism, etc. But then what also they're doing, and this was just revealed by some leaks in the past year, is that these Canadian military intelligence units are actually like data mining social
Mhm.
media accounts of Canadians. This is the type of thing that when you talk about it, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but this was a leak that was reported on in mainstream media showing, for instance, how many thousands of social media accounts of Ontarians during the pandemic were being illegally data mined by the Canadian military. And then, of course, how the Canadian forces also made a point of monitoring and compiling data on the Black Lives Matter movement in Ontario. We only know about this because there was a leak. This is kind of the norm, not the exception. And this is what these hundreds of employees are doing, right? So they are, and they've put in their materials right now that they are developing their skills in influence operations. That means propaganda, right? That means data mining. That means surveillance. And the idea is that it's explicit that that's to be directed either to overseas populations or to Canadians. And I mean, another example of this crossover of military and policing is that another major purchase the Canadian military is in the process of making that folks aren't talking about as much is Canada's first ever armed drones. Um, so this is another multi-billion dollar planned purchase. And I read through the 100-page government proposal, so you all didn't have to. And it explicitly said the one scenario that these drones would be designed for is for domestic surveillance missions. And the example it gave of a theoretical example of how these drones would be used, it literally said that it would be to surveil activists protesting a G20 summit in Quebec. This is a theoretical scenario they've written. And it says that the drone would help the security team intercept and identify the occupants of a vehicle who they describe as anti-capitalist radicals who were intending to hang a banner concerning global warming. This is the scenario for which these armed drones for the Canadian military are being developed. Of course, they also listed scenarios where a drone is bombing fighting age males in the Middle East after seeing one of them holding a cell phone. So, I mean, and this is what is kind of officially on the documents for these new armed drones that they're purchasing. So just to kind of, yeah, further jump into that. But I also just want to bring us back to the conversation I mean, so we talked about how there's all these plans to purchase hundreds of billions of dollars in new weaponry, whether it's the F-35, whether it's the armed drones. But the most recent one is actually this new fleet of warships.
Mhm.
And I should say all of these contracts, the majority is going directly to US companies. The warships, the contract is directly being awarded to Irving, um, company slash family that owns New Brunswick and beyond. So, I mean, these are warships. These are not defensive weapons, regardless of what the Canadian government says about them. They're designed for offensive military operations. And so I looked into just in the past few weeks, well, what does Canada even do with its existing warships? Because I realized I didn't actually know that. Um, and was discovering how just in the past month, it turns out that a Canadian Navy warship, the HMCS Ottawa, traveled for the first time ever through the Taiwan Strait, so in the South China Sea, accompanying a US warship. I cannot imagine a possible purpose for this move. I mean, other than to support the US military in provoking tensions and stoking war with China. I wanted to come back to this because we've sort of touched about this earlier, but I mean, I'm curious what the rest of you think about this kind of deliberate stoking of tensions and um, I mean, and as has come up multiple times in this call, like I think of these weapon systems the same way I think of pipelines. They're many, many billions of dollars, hugely harmful, very expensive and difficult to build. And you don't build them just in case. You build them in order to use them for many decades to come. I know it's not exactly a question, but I'm really curious what you think about this.
Maybe I can just jump in on a couple of things. One thing, just before talking about warships, is, how you were describing it, Rachel. I kept thinking, right, and there's someone asking this question, do you love Canada in the chat? And I want to say, what is Canada, right? Because the Canada you're describing is the Canada that is at war with the rest of us, right? It steals our land, it surveils us, it polices us, it suppresses us, it kills our families here and around the world, it steals from us, it denies us. This Canada we hate, right? Obviously, it is the oppressor. Um, and so I think it's really important to sort of distinguish that. I think on the question of the warships, I have 2 points. One is we have to ask ourselves where all this money is coming from, right? Like all of this militarization, all of this money is coming from, in part, and going to the Irving family. So it's coming from taxpayers and it's going to um, massive multi-billion dollar corporations. Now, at a time when the tariffs are going to potentially result in some sort of a recession, so you have a recession potentially coming, and you have this massive buildup. So that's government funds being redirected in those directions. Also, because of, for example, the changes to the immigration policy, there's a $50 billion drop in tax revenue, just tax revenue, not GDP growth from the immigration changes, because migrants pay into taxes and don't use services. So it's a huge number of people. So when there's so much money being spent and so little money keep coming in, we're going to see attacks on all of our public services from an austerity agenda. So as this arms buildup is happening, what happens to our healthcare system, what happens to our education system. So I think, people will feel like will feel the impacts of this arms buildup and this drop in tax revenue, particularly if, a former world like banker becomes the prime minister. So I really want to sort of stress that. And I think coming back to the world, we must take seriously the fact of that all of this is directed. These tariffs are directed to making China weaker, but not just China. I think what we're seeing is the rise of the global south, the formation of the BRICS. It's incongruent. It's not all good, but we're seeing new forces and countries beginning to challenge US economic hegemony. So when the economic hegemony is challenged, what they have that the rest of us don't have is 900 plus bases around the world, right? And so America, through its current focus on getting NATO, Europe, and Canada to arm itself, is it's actually expanding its forces for the Great World War. It wants to rage against every country challenging its economic might. That's the Trump project. That's the Trump project as clearly as light. And as Clayton said, as we see this huge climate catastrophe happening, that also means containing people where they are so they don't move. It also means extracting wealth and resources from collapsing economies. It is what it's the US is testing out in Ukraine now. So just to put it all, like it's we have to sever our ties from the US. Like I think it is a worthwhile project. That's not what Elbows Up is doing. It's doing the absolute opposite. It is deeper integration. We're not in a tariff war. We're in a deeper integration with the United States, but we need to realign ourselves.
Yeah, we need, pathways to Sundance, not pipelines to prisons, and a lot of our young people, because of the austerity agenda that Hassan is talking about, the way that manifests in reserves in Canada is just absolutely just destruction and poverty, you know. Um, like I had the privilege to work in my nation last year for the winter, and it's really bad. And it's like that on every res. And these extractive industries, especially mining companies and forestry operators and stuff, and the construction companies that, are grandfathered in and have political friends so they can bid on all the northern procurement infrastructure construction contracts that the provinces and the territories in Canada dole out. You'd think Native people were the richest people ever with all this construction up north and everything, but all that shit is all grandfathered in old relationships. If we just tweaked the transfer payments, the $8 billion transfer payments that Canada sends to First Nations, just tweak the supply chain and made sure that number one, all the suppliers, for Native communities were Native. We put like 2, 3 billion into the native economy in this country. Wouldn't be worried about us. We'd pay for our own social programs. But Canada continues to molest our communities. The corporations they're working in collusion with, they molest our communities. Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution says that our right to hunt, fish, and trap should not be molested by anyone. But this shit keeps going on, and every time we step up to fight back, they send in their special forces and they come in and they cause all kinds of destruction and they burn our cabins down and they've made it so impossible. Like I'm a pretty successful dude, like as far as like natives from the West End of Winnipeg. Like I've done a lot in my life. I've, contributed. And you'd think that a 47-year-old man who's a best-selling author, that moving home to the res could be an easy thing. Like it's something that should be able to pull off. But I'll tell you something, it was fucking impossible. There's no housing. There's like 40 people per house on every reserve. There's nowhere to go. Um, so can you build new? No, not without the permission of Indian Affairs. You'd think I could build a house anywhere on my land. So Canada, part of this militarization and austerity agenda is they fuck with every economic play every single First Nation makes to get a one leg up, on economic development, but also on self-governance over our social programs. Like they literally are suing Native kids who were abused in care. Every year they're holding off Cindy Blackstock and all these kids, the children that they like molested in care. And Canada's like, no, no, we're not going to take responsibility for that. And so it's just so bad on the res that they just hope that our people will leave our land and come to the city and pay taxes, but that's just not going to happen. Um, and so, I really encourage everybody to reach out across social movement silos. We need to be having conversations like this where we come together and we talk about what our communities are facing and identify what our common goals are, how our oppression and most importantly our liberation is united, and then we need to get to it. We need to be investing in the base building strategy of the biggest social movement we've ever experienced. I used to say it was for climate change, but I think, it's against militarization, man, because at the end of the day, like I said before, the US military is the biggest fucking greenhouse gangster on the planet, and we need to stop them. Like all those hundreds of bases, man, like they're setting up for something big, and whether that's with China or Russia, who the heck knows? Um, but we need to like make sure and not be complicit in genocide and war. A big shout out to all the relations in Palestine, free Palestine, and down with the Zionist lobby here in this country and all the war that they're trying to poison our children's minds with their Zionist agenda.
Well, I was gonna say, I think we have kind of time for, I know we didn't open up a Q&A, but I've been paying attention to the questions in the chat, and most of them kind of coalesce on a question that I think Clayton actually kind of just gave up some of his answer to. But I mean, there's been several questions to the effect of, I'll just read them. Given the theme for tonight being more militarism is not the answer, and we've established the dominance of global militarized thinking, what are the options to pull in the other direction? How do we accomplish them? Someone else asked, why is this problem of militarization not in the public consciousness? How can we bring this conversation into public attention? Is there a way in which things being so stark and awful can open up possibilities to see and resist the way things have actually been for a long time? Kind of a what can we do in this moment sort of question. I think when you maybe started answering that, I'd love to hear maybe Hassan and Tyler what you think as well, and if you had any other thoughts, Clayton, and then I think we'll wrap up.
I mean, I think I feel like everything Clayton just said in some ways is like a last word. I don't even really want to. I don't want to add much to it because I think it's been said. Like I, on a personal level, like Hassan, you'll remember. Like I remember being really involved in a lot of political work. 10, 15 years ago here in Toronto, and feeling like there was momentum and it was beginning and links were there. They weren't great, and organizations didn't always get along, and some were better than others, but there was something. I mean, there was some effort to be building something, even flawed though it might have been. And I don't know, I don't know if others share this feeling, but personally, I've felt like the last 10 years have been just such a decomposition of what there was. And when there are moments, I'm thinking of Wet'suwet'en, for instance. It's like it felt like it was so hard to build solidarity. It's like there's these moments of political action, but it's hard to bring different parts, different pieces, and different communities together to fight all of these fronts at the same time. So for me, it's been I've felt pretty demoralized, I think, in this last stretch. And so, in some ways, I hope, listening to Clayton, it's like I want to be more involved in this. I want to start bringing more of my students into this, and instead of, teaching has felt like just this kind of depressing cycle where, the colleges use predatory recruiting to bring in, poor kids from other parts of the world who are tempted by the prospect of a better life and permanent residency, which of course that door gets slammed on most of them pretty quickly. And instead, they just sort of work in minimum wage jobs for a few years here, and don't have time or energy or the capacity to be part of broader organizing and political building against the things that we're trying to fight against. So I'm the wrong guy to ask because have been pretty demoralized. So I'm going to stop and listen to people that have more to say on this because it's doing me good to listen to you.
The honesty is appreciated, Tyler.
Thank you for that, Tyler. I mean, we we have to join organizations. I would say to everyone who's listening, step one, join an organization. I don't care what that is. Join your union, join your local tenant group, join an activist group, join something. It is impossible to do this alone. And we are in a moment of hyper individuation, right? Um, you know, Trump, for example, was running between 35 and 40,000 different ad messages at the same time, which means specific subsections of people receiving one message and no one else saw it. We are living in this world where every phone has a, mobile ad ID, and you can target ads to singular devices that nobody else will ever see, and it will show up in any one of your apps, no matter what you're running. And particularly coming out of COVID, we have seen a shift in organizing culture where We're organizing, over WhatsApp groups and Signal groups. You go to sleep, you wake up. If you miss a day, then decisions have been made. People need to be in meetings. And we've sort of arrived at this place where people have started saying, well, that's ableist to expect everyone to do the same. No, there are ways to have meetings with people. I organize particularly migrant farm workers, domestic workers, refugees, undocumented people, people who work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, who don't all speak the same language, who don't have access to phones, who are living in prisons that their employers run, where anyone can overhear and can result in their deportation and banning. And they are in meetings. So I would just say the absolute number one thing we need to do is that the more of us that are organized in spaces, then we can knit them. Then we can talk about knitting, but everyone's sort of stepped away from collective struggle. And that is what they want is they want us to be consumers and voters. Those are individual choices. We have to, all we have, they control the military, the police, the government, the tax system, the education system, the healthcare system. We have only our collective power in numbers. And that has to be like 100%. If anyone's here, I'd say get off this call and join an organization.
Yeah, and on that note, it can't be, there's not a more accurate statement, Hassan, to describe the collective rights of indigenous peoples. Like I was pulling my hair out all year running the consultative process in my community. Well, not running it, but supporting the guy who was, just to get our people together so they could learn about what a fucking gold mine means to our fishery, you know? I wasn't even being like all hardcore activisty about it because I didn't want anybody to get scared. I wanted the elders and the youth, to everybody to understand what the heck our nation was considering, right? And the main point that I was trying to convey to all my Native brothers and sisters is that our rights as Indigenous peoples, that S at the end of peoples, represents 30 years of advocacy in the UN system by all kinds of different Native people from across the planet. And the difference between Indigenous peoples and Indigenous people, that S at the end of Indigenous peoples represents the difference between human rights and the collective rights of indigenous peoples, which are fundamentally rooted in sovereignty and self-determination. And in the UN's own Charter of Rights, it stipulates that indigenous peoples are the only people on Mother Earth, that have the right to sovereignty and self-determination with the member states, okay, the settler colonial states. And that's a major thing. And so Canada and its austerity agenda and its militarization of our spaces, every freaking space we go to, even our bodies, is about keeping us from coming together and heading in the same direction together and asserting our title together and defending the land together and protecting the sacredness of water together and defending the climate together. We have the power, and we've demonstrated it dozens and dozens of times, over 200 Supreme Court decision victories in these colonial courts, and we have put a stop to the world's most powerful extractive industries who are trying to double the size of the tar sands. We fucking stopped them with with half a dozen pipeline campaigns. Brutal fight. I mean, it drove me insane. I had to step back. I almost died. I had a heart attack this Christmas from that crazy work. But we need everybody to step up in the Native community to understand that our rights are fundamentally based on they're collective in design. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, you can't pull one article out. All those articles together make the lowest minimum standard for settler colonial states to establish their policies with indigenous peoples that they're living in occupation, whose lands they're living in occupation on. And then it's meant to be built upon and strengthened, not watered down, not to take the right to develop out or for the left to take the right to say no, free, prior, and informed consent out. No, the entire declaration is a collective rights assertion. And Native people, our treaty rights, our inherent rights here in Canada, those are collective in design. That's why nobody owns the land or the water or the climate. It belongs to our children. We're just taking care of it. And our advocacy and our social movements and our power in the courts and our power in this economy is based on our ability to get along and to, not to like each other, but to get along and to take care of those responsibilities in a good way. And so, yeah, I hope that helps everybody understand stuff a little better.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks so much to all three of you. Maybe I'll give a little bit of a quick pitch that, well, I know that the co-host organization of this event, Peace Brigades International, they train and send folks overseas to physically accompany communities and human rights defenders who are like literally a threat of being assassinated and often are assassinated, and they like train folks to go and like walk beside these folks in like a really strong show of solidarity and internationalism and like connecting across borders. And of course, World Beyond War, we're running campaigns around most of the things that I brought up on this call. If you go to noarmedrones.ca, you'll see our campaign around these armed drones. We've been running a campaign to cancel the F-35 fighter jets for years. Um, and we're one of many organizations right now behind this organizing around the Vote Palestine platform, which is not about everyone's individual vote, really, in a few weeks. It's about building that collective power in the lead up, during, and well following an election. I would encourage folks to check that out. And of course, there are moments to show up on the streets. There's going to be some huge marches at Ottawa, and then also a sister one on the West Coast on April 12th, in just a few days. Really showing up hard for Palestine. Though there are also moments where we directly confront the military-industrial complex, whether that's folks who are doing blockades at weapons factories, or, for example, in Ottawa at CanSec every year, which is when like literally all the people who profit most from war and violence on the planet all gather in Ottawa for a humongous weapons fair where they like literally parade their tanks and their Black Hawk helicopters. There are many ways to show up, and I agree that it has to happen with that kind of visionary idea of what abolition looks like and what the world we want looks like, but also in groups and with other people. And I'm just super appreciative to the three of you for joining today and really kind of engaging deep, and to everyone who joined us today. We'll follow up, and of course the work continues. So thank you so much to all of you.
Whoa, right as you said that, a massive bald eagle just flew right over my window. So that's pretty cool.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.